Hello everyone and welcome to another tutorial. In this one, I want to show you a way to animate growing plants, flowers, whatever. It is quite easy but also a bit deceptive, I'd say. So let's delete this, Shift A, curve, and find a Bezier, tap, and just delete everything. And then let's connect our draw pencil here. Press numpad 1 to go into, numpad 1 to go into front or side view, whatever. And draw your shape of your plant that you think looks cool. Maybe something like that. Maybe not. Maybe something like that. I think that's fine. Maybe something like that. It doesn't matter. But it still does a little. Let's go to Geometry Node Editor in a new window. Press N to close that menu. And let's actually click New. Right? A new Geometry Node setup. Now, to control the growth of our plant, the first thing I want to add is something to control how far up this plant goes, which is basically a Shift A trim curve node, right? Because now if we control the end, so we can control how long the plant is, for example, right? So right away, we're going to connect this to the group input, and let's press N, go to the group tab, and let's control this, and let's name this to be length, I guess. Or growth, perhaps. There we go. Press N again. Now in the modifier panel, you will have a growth value. Growth to 0 and 1. And we want to control a lot of parameters based on that growth value. Beautiful. Now, we're gonna continue by actually adding some sub-branching on this as well, right? So let's do that by dragging this out to, let's say, an instance on points. But before we do that, we need to Shift A, curve to points. There we go. Now let's move this to the right. There we go. Shift A, join geometry. And let's join all of this back up. Now, we can actually find an instance and drag that out to a curve line, for example. Curve line. Beautiful. And we can play around with that. Now, I don't want to spawn sub-branches on the entire curve, but at a specific points or specific part of our curves, let's say from there to there. So to do that, let's drag this to the left, find another trim curve or Shift D, the one you already have, and then you can crank down the end and crank up the start, so they are only spawned at a specific place on your curve. Beautiful. Now, we of course need a rotation that matches our curve as well. So let's move our instance on points to the right and all of it to the right a bit. And let's move our curve line here for now, right? Because we're now going to play around with the rotation. Now, whenever we use a curved points node, we get a tangent, normal, and rotation value. And that is usually a lot of fun to work with. Because we already can rotate based on these values, right? The tangent of the curve, normal, and we have the rotation that the points have. So what we can do is drag this out to an align rotation to vector. And we want to use the tangent, which is the direction of the curve. That is the tangent vector. We want to use that to control the rotation, for example, right? So let's crank in the tangent and the rotation to the rotation of the instance on point. So you can see that right away, our curves are rotated according to our curve tangents. Now, perhaps we can use the normal instead. There we go. And they are now aligned to the normal directions as well. Now, this is used quite interchangeably. Is that a word? Perhaps. So we can also use normal and set this to a different align rotation value, right? The Z is the tangent and Y is usually the normal, which is just beautiful. So let's go with this first. So this is, let's just rename this to align to normal. Normal. There we go. And now let's rotate this a bit in a random direction, right? Random this so it's not all pointing in this direction. To do that, Shift A, rotate rotation. No, Shift A, rotate rotation. And this is Blender 4.2. I think these nodes got introduced in 4.0. Don't quote me on that. And we can rotate this into the axis that we want. X is not the one. Y is not the one. Is Z the one? Let's see. Let's set this to local, by the way. Local and then the Y. So you see the Y direction rotates. It's perfectly around the tangent. Amazing. So that's just a cheap, easy way to do that. So we want to rotate this by a random value. So drag this out to a combine XYZ. And the Y value, drag that out to a random value. Now to rotate this completely around a curve, 360 degrees, we need a value of 2 pi, which is just math, right? A circle is 2 pi, 180 degrees is usually pi, which means that if we set the minimum value to minus pi and the max to pi, you can just type in py, we actually get a full circle of random rotations. Beautiful. As you can see. Amazing. Now, let's say we want to align this a bit more into the tangent direction after all, so it moves a bit more up as well. What we can do is just align it once again, or we can actually mix this up with the tangent. Okay, so let's think about the best way to do that. Okay, so let's try both ways. Shift A, find an align rotation to vector there. And rotation is this input, and the vector is going to be the tangent that we already have in the Z direction. Now this is completely going to align it in the tangent. I want this to align a bit in the tangent. And to do that, let's move this a bit more to the right once again. We can actually just Shift A, find a mix node, and set this to rotation, and connect that there, and just mix it before we align it with after we align it. There we go, right? So now the more we crank this to 0, the more it's going to be aligned to the tangent. The more we crank this to the right, the more it's going to be aligned in the normals. Right, beautiful. So let's say we want something like this, perhaps. Quite cool. And we can even base this vector of how aligned it is to the tangent based on how far it is along a curve. All right. So to do this, and I'm going to use this value more often in my setup as well. The spline parameter of our main curve is a very important one, because that is basically the growth pattern as well here. And we can drag this to the left, find Shift A, a store named attribute. There we go. Float is fine. And drag this out to a spline parameter. There we go. And let's name this par for spline parameter. Okay. So that is looking beautiful. All right. So we're storing our parameter, and we want to use that to control our vector. So Shift A, find a named attribute, because we stored our parameter at the start, and we can use this to control the mix vector for the rotation here. So if you connect this right now, you can see that the start is more aligned into the tangent, and the end is more aligned into the normals. And if you want to flip that around, we can hit Shift A and find a float curve, perhaps, and then drag this down, drag this up. And we can control just how far, or from which points they are more aligned into the normals, and which points they are more aligned into the tangents. All right. So you can just play around with that. Now, what I want to do as well, and let's actually clean this up a tiny bit. So this mix node with this float curve and this parameter, let's move this just below each other. Right. So this is one setup. Let's connect all of this. Control J, frame this. And let's name this our norm tang mix. There we go. Beautiful. Align to normal. That is random rotation. And this is align to tangent. Align to tangent, random rotation. And that this is our norm tang mix, I would say. So then I want to use the same parameter, right? The vector, how far a point is along a curve. I want to use that to control the length of our curve, and we can actually control the scaling of the curve, right? Which means we can just connect this parameter into the scale, and right away you can see that they start small and end big. So I want to swap that around with, let's just duplicate this float curve, connect it there, press Alt P to get that out of the frame there. Let's move everything a bit more to the right to get more space. There we go. All right. And let's actually Shift D this as well and Alt P. And connect that into the value here. So this is then our scaling. So Shift connect or Shift select, Ctrl J, and name this parameter scaling. There we go. And this is norm tang mix. Beautiful. So then we can actually swap. Well, we already swapped it around, but we can control just how far that scaling goes. Something like that is quite beautiful. All right. Now, of course, we want to control the scaling of this with the growth as well, because if this is a smaller plant, these curves, the sub-branches need to be smaller too. Now to do that, we can drag everything more to the right. Yeah, so we keep on dragging. We can hit Shift A, find a math value, set to multiply there, and we can use Shift A, a group input, the growth into that value, right? Which means that if our growth is 0, our multiplication factor is going to be 0, and if it's 1, it's going to be 1, which means it's going to be growing quite beautifully. Now we can even find Shift A float curve here to remap that, and everything is moving to the right. If you want to undo that, the automatic moving from Blender, you can just press Ctrl Z once. There we go. And we can now control exactly at what time, at what growth it is going to be small and where it's going to be big. Let's say I want this to be smaller for a longer time and then get bigger once the growth is really picking up, like that. Quite beautiful. And then we can actually already start worrying about the sub-branch look, let's say. Right, usually they hang down a little bit, so what we can do is after we add instance on points, we can hit Shift A, a realize instance. There we go. Move this all the way to the right. Shift A, find a set position, and we want to set the position into a negative direction a little bit. Let's say minus 0.3. But not for the entire curve, but only for the, or well, the more up they move away from the curve, so the heavier, the more gravity is involved. For example, here is more weight of the entire curve, which means they usually would fall down more. That's just how that works. We can actually use another spline parameter, right? Because we now realize our curves, they will get their own spline parameters because they are now curves of themselves, right? Which means we now have a value from here, 0, to here, for example, 1. Which means we can use that to set a position, and the offset, we can drag this out to a mix vector. Let's just find a mix. There we go. And we can use the spline parameter, Shift A spline parameter vector as our vector here. And we can then mix this between 0 and minus 0.3. And now you can see we're just moving our endpoints down, and the start points are staying in place. Beautiful. Now, I don't want this to be happening in a straight line, but more in a curve. But right now, this is happening in a linear motion because we only have 2 points. Whenever you use a curved line, you get 2 points. A curved line has a start and an endpoint, 2 points, which means if we move our endpoint down and our start point stays in the same place, of course, we get a straight line. So what we can do is press Shift A, find a resample curve here. 10 is fine. Ctrl Z if you want to undo that annoying automatic movement there. Something like that. And then we can actually move our position down based on the vector. But let's move this to the right. Let's make this more curved by adding a float curve. And then we can actually make this look more rounded, like you can see. Beautiful. Maybe we want more, 16. Right, you can actually make this drip down a bit more gracefully, like so. Amazing. Okay, that is already looking quite nice. Now, I also want this to be based on the length of the spline, right? The longer a curve is, the more it would usually drape down because it's heavier. So to do that, we can hit Shift A. Or actually, let's drag this out to a combine XYZ. There we go, and find a Z value of minus 0.5. We can now set this Z value based on Shift A spline length node. And the spline length node gets the length of each individual spline, which is each sub-branch as well. And we can use this, crank this into the Z value. You can see what is happening now. Let's find Shift A math node and multiply this with minus 1. There we go, so it's actually moving them down. So the longer a curve is now, the more they are actually going to be dripping down. All right, makes sense. And if you want this to be affecting it less, you can just duplicate this into a math node. Where is a math? We already are a math node, there we go. And we can set this to be 0.5, for example, right? You can see just how much this is going to be draping down. Okay, now let's find where we control the scaling based on the initial parameter. And let's actually just move this a bit more down, like so. Now, when we animate this, it is feeling a bit rigid in terms of how the branches scale. And that is because we get our parameter before we trim our curve, which means that this parameter value will actually not change. So let's quickly swap this around, which means just connecting this in here. Shift right mouse to connect these dots and then connect this there. And this there. There we go. Beautiful. So now when we animate this growth, it's actually a bit more organic, meaning that the branches here will actually start out way smaller than the ones at the end. Beautiful. So that is already a cool starting place, I would say. Now you could even add more branches on the sub branches. I'm just cleaning this up very quickly. There we go. I like placing things below each other just because it satisfies my column kind of vibe, I would say. Now we can actually take this one step further by adding another set of iterations for sub branches. Now we already have a system in play that works, which is exactly this together with this. And, well, this as well, perhaps, right? This is all our sub-branching stuff. So we can actually group this by pressing Ctrl G. There we go. Then we can expose some values if we would like that, right? Which means we have one value exposed right here, which comes from, let's exit our group. This is our group input, right? Our growth. And now we can actually clean everything up way more to create a much cleaner setup here and there. And let's rename this to sub-branching. There we go. Now let's move into that. And I want to expose the start in the group and the end in the group. And press N. Let's rename our value to, that was the growth input that we have here. And then this is our start trim. And this is our end trim. And let's see if there's anything else we want to be controlling as well. Perhaps how many points we want. So the amount of points. Count is fine. Let's add that to the top actually. And let's exit our group. So now we have sub-branching going on. And we can actually redo the sub-branching. So to do that, Shift D that and connect this in here. And then join that up here as well. And now you can see we're actually adding some new sub-branching. Now let's go into this group because it is way too big, which means we need to actually change the scaling. And we can do that by either changing the curve length or just the scale overall. So Shift A finds a math node, multiply. Now default, I want this to be 1. There we go. So let's connect that to our group input as well. And we can also just drag out, let go and find a group input. And let's rename this to length. There we go. Exit group. And now we can change the individual length of our additional subcurves right there. And then we can change the trim and the end trim as well. Something like that. Oh. Now I want this. The scaling of this curve is now based on our main curve. I also want it to be scaled on the subcurve here, which means that in our sub-branching, we actually need to store our parameter as well. All right. So to do that, we go to the end here, or we don't even need to go to the end. We can exit our group. We can actually find Shift A store named attribute here. And we can name this to be par sub parameter, I guess. Drag this out to a spline parameter. We can use the par sub to scale our branching once again. Now to do that, we need to go into our group and we need to add expose another value to our scaling instances. So let's move this there and let's move all of this a bit more to the left. Let's make some room here. Find another multiply node, set this to 1, because that is the default value we want for whenever we don't use a parameter input, and then expose this to a group input. Group input. There we go. Press N, and let's rename this to parameter input. Exit group. So here the parameter input is just 1, but here we want another parameter input based on the par sub. An easier way to do that is just to delete this and find a capture attribute, right? Because we're using that value right away, which means that storing it is a bit unnecessary. So let's set this to point and factor in there, and then we just connect this into that parameter there. Now we need to flip that, so Shift A, find a map range node and set this to 1 and 0, right? And then we're actually creating a beautiful sub-branching spawn. Okay, now we can change the scale if we want the length to be a bit longer, a bit more crazy perhaps, like so. Okay, and now if we grow this, you can see, and actually control the growth here as well with the growth value that we have here, right? Our group input growth. We can just duplicate that and connect that in the growth here. Beautiful. Now if we scale this down, you can see we're getting a beautiful growth pattern. Now, I don't really like the way this is scaled up and down yet, those sub-branches, so perhaps we can add another value to scale that, just to make it look more natural. Let's move this to the right. Go into our sub-branching, and into the scaling here, I want to add another multiply value that we connect to a group input. And let's rename that to be our additional scaling. There we go. And exit the group. So now we have an additional value that we expose to be scaled with what we want. And I just want to scale this based on, let's say, the length of these splines. So capture another attribute and Shift A, find a spline length node and capture this and then connect that into our additional scale. All right, and that means that our scaling is also going to be based on how long those curves are. All right, how long our sub-branches are. And that means that they should just scale down and up a bit nicer. Perhaps we hit Shift A and find a math node and just multiply that entire value just slightly, so they're all at least a bit longer. Or we can hit perhaps Control X that. Let's just crank our overall value up a bit more of the map range nodes that we control the parameter with, right? Which means they are all just going to be a bit longer. Something like that. Now, there is too much loose string here, so let's actually change the start and end growth of this subcurves. And trim can be a bit higher, I suppose. Start trim can be a bit lower. Like that. Beautiful. Now there is only a very small amount of sub-branching going on there, sub-branching, and which is because of our additional scaling values, which is based on the spline length. So perhaps we can remap that, Shift A, find a map range node. So it is not always 0, but it's always some kind of a value, something like that. So now let's play around with our random rotation as well. Go into our sub-branching, expose your random value seed here in the group, exit our group, and now we can play around with the random rotation seed of our curves as well. Now the reason that this is all rotated downwards is, let's go into the sub-branching, is because of this set position node, right? The thing that's actually giving it a bit of gravity. So perhaps it's giving it a bit too much gravity, which means we can just set our multiply factor to be a bit lower, something like that. Perhaps it's looking a bit better. Yeah, I like that a lot more. And let's expose this, of course, to a group input. Shift or press N, sorry, and name this to draping. Exit group. This draping is minus 0.28. I want my other draping to be slightly more, I suppose. A bit more down, or yeah, that's fine. And let's just reduce the length a little bit as well. Or do we like the length? Something like that. And we can go into the group once again and expose one more value. I promise we're almost there. The latest one is our norm tang mix, pretty much. And what I want to expose is hit Shift A, find a math node, set to add, Ctrl Z if you want to redo that automatic movement. So the higher we set this value, the more they are aligned to the normal, and the lower we set this, the more they are aligned to our tangent. So I want this default set to 0, drag that out to a group input, press N, and let's rename this to tangent alignment. There we go. Exit group. And now we can, of course, play around with that for our sub-branching and for our actual branching. Right? Sorry, wrong value. Right there. Alright, so we can really play around with the way this looks quite beautifully. Amazing. Something like that. Let's make our length a bit longer. There we go. So this is looking quite interesting, in my opinion, at least. Right, so let's have them start a bit sooner. Like that. And we can add way more count as well. Now, if you want to make this more populated, you can do that like that. Now, if you want this growth to show up, lower it. And I actually think this grows very naturally now. I quite like that. Now, we need to add thickness to this entire bunch, of course. To do that, we usually use Shift-A, curve to mesh. Curve to mesh. We can just curve to mesh this at the very end. Our profile curve is going to be a curve circle. There we go. Set the resolution to like 3. We don't need a lot. And crank this down. Now, this may be a little bit slow because we've got a lot of stuff going on. But we will be able to see what is happening very shortly. So this is just our curve to mesh node. The radius of our actual curve we can set with a set curve radius node. And we want to do this individually for each branching level. So this is our main branch. Shift-A set curve radius. Set curve radius. I want to do this for the sub branch as well. And for the latest third branching as well. Now this radius of the main curve I want to have defined, drag this out by a spline parameter, right? Which means that now it's going to be 0 at the start and 1 at the end. We can flip that by pressing map range and setting this to 1 and 0. There we go. Now we can do the same for our sub curve, right? We want this to be based on the same values here. So let's just move this up so we can duplicate this. We want to have this set by the same values. So you can tell that this doesn't really follow the scaling of the main curve yet, right? They are only based on their own curve parameter. So to also base it on the main curve parameter, we already exposed or stored that value here. We can hit Shift-A and find a named attribute and set that to our par. Shift-A math node and multiply that with our original parameter value. Of course, we need to also flip that around. So let's hide this and Shift-D there. And now our bottom curves are bigger than our top curves. Beautiful. Now we need to do the same steps for our third curve. Right? So we can duplicate this. Let's set it there. Connect that to the radius. And then we also want this to be based on this, right? On our main curve with a multiply. Connect that up there. And this third curve, we also want to base on the parameter value of our sub-branching, right? It has to be based on our main, our sub, and that's it. And its own, of course. So shift the right mouse, drag this to connect, Shift-A, store named attribute, and we can name this par sub for sub parameter and drag this out to a spline parameter. There we go. So now we're storing the parameter, the spline parameter of our sub branches that we can now access to do another multiplication, named attributes into a par sub here. Beautiful. Now, of course, map range that as well. And there we go. So the closer this is to the actual stem, the bigger the radius. So that is already looking quite interesting, right? So it's a bit of chaotic plant, I suppose. But it looks quite interesting and it grows quite cool as well. All right, so let's add way more sub-branching, 300 perhaps. There we go. And we could also add way more sub-branching, right? About there. And this is more of like a pine cone kind of plant, I guess. It's not actually got leaves, but more pines, right? I quite like that. Then at the end of our geo node, we can hit Shift-A, set the material, and hit new. For our materials, call this leaf, I don't know, set leaf there, go to shader editor, and let's go to render view. I'm in cycles, by the way. We can hit home, and then we can set a nice base color that is a bit dry, like that, suppose. And then we can add a little bit of Shift A, add shader, a little bit of translucency. So translucent BSDF. We can set this to be the same material, but a bit more dark, I suppose. But make it a bit translucent. That always looks quite cool. Something like that. I make this a bit more dark, I suppose. And let's add an environment texture here. Color, environment texture. I'm going to open up an HDRI. You can get them from polyhaven.com, I suppose. And set this to be Whipple Creek, for example. Let's hide that in film and transparent. And then you can already tell what this looks like, right? Up the roughness a tiny bit. And there we go. Maybe a bit more translucency. The lighter you make it, the more translucent it's going to be. The darker you make it, the less translucent it's going to be. All right, keep that in mind. Something like that looks quite interesting. A pine cone. Quite interesting, I'd say. A dry pine cone. And perhaps we should just make this green, you know, for the thumbnail. People like things that are alive, I suppose. So maybe we should just make this more actual green. Helps. Something like that. Make this a bit more dark as well. Yeah, something like that, I suppose. So that already looks quite cool, like a plant, right? So if you now grow your plant, you can just set your growth here in your GeoNodes editor. And you can just set that to whatever value you want. You can make this grow as an animation, grow to 1. And what I notice is that we don't even scale our original geometry, original curve radius here. We are not scaling this stuff with our spline length yet. So we need to do that. So to do that, hit Shift A and find a math node. And let's just scale this with spline length. There we go. And this may be a little bit big. Set this to multiply, by the way. Multiply is a lot better. There we go. And we want to do the same thing with our subcurve. Scale that by spline length. There we go. Length to there. And hello. I have 2 there. And do the same thing for our third curve as well. Of course, scale with spline length. And then everything gets more thin, but we can now just multiply this by a specific value that we like 3. That is looking quite cool. 5 maybe? 5. Same thing for our subcurve. We can just multiply that radius with a specific value that we like. 3. That's a bit much, actually. Maybe 1 was better. Yeah, 1 was cool. And then you can see it is looking very, very beautiful, right? Let's say we have our main curve here. I want to change that just ever so slightly. So let's add a float curve. Just so we can crank down the endpoints just a bit more. Just a bit more thin there. That's the top. Yeah, I quite like that. So that is how you set that up. If you like this, please leave a like, a comment, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. Cheers.